They found the telegraph key in a glass case at the back of the museum. Munich, 1998. A small brass device worn smooth by decades of use, the kind of tool that once connected continents with nothing but electrical pulses and human precision. The placard beside it was simple, austere even. Belonged to Margarete Schneider, 1922 to 1998, the hand that should have been amputated. Below that, a photograph, black and white. A young woman's right hand X-rayed, showing 5 fingers with metal pins and surgical wire holding shattered bones together. The image was dated April 1945, Fort Sam, Houston, Texas. Beside it, another X-ray from 1975. The same hand, 30 years older. The bones perfectly healed, every finger intact. The museum curator who found the key after Margaret's death said she kept it in a wooden box beside her bed. She died alone in her apartment. No husband, no children. Just the key and a letter she'd read so many times the paper had worn thin at the creases. This is the story of that hand, and the 4 hours that saved it, and the 52 years of guilt that followed. If you find stories like this, meaningful stories that show us what people are capable of in the worst of times, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel. We bring you true accounts from history that deserve to be remembered. Now let us go back to April 1945, to a supply truck rolling through the ruins of Bavaria, and to a young woman whose entire future was about to change. The truck flipped at 3:47 in the afternoon on April 8, 1945. Margarete Schneider would remember that detail for the rest of her life. Not because she looked at her watch. The watch had stopped working 6 months earlier and she'd never bothered to wind it again. Time didn't matter much anymore. The Third Reich was collapsing like a building with its foundation blown out, and what good was knowing the exact moment of your destruction? No. She remembered the time because the soldier driving the truck had checked his watch just before the American artillery shell hit the road 30 meters ahead. He'd said it out loud. 15:47. Still 3 hours to the checkpoint. They never made it to the checkpoint. The explosion threw a fountain of dirt and asphalt into the air. The driver yanked the wheel hard to the right. Too hard. The truck overloaded with communications equipment and ammunition crates, and too many people who'd once thought they were on the winning side went up on 2 wheels. For a moment, Margaret thought it might settle back down. Physics had other plans. The world rotated 90 degrees. Then everything was noise and impact and the smell of diesel and screaming. Margaret had been sitting in the back of the truck, pressed against the wooden slats, cradling her telegraph equipment on her lap like it was something precious. Because it was. The device was her skill, her purpose, her ticket out of factory work that would have broken her back by age 30. She'd volunteered for communications duty in 1943, when the Wehrmacht still took women for auxiliary roles, still pretended there was glory in serving the fatherland. Her father had tried to talk her out of it. He was a clockmaker in Munich, a quiet man who worked with tiny gears and springs, who'd taught Margarete that precision was a virtue and haste was the enemy of craft. "Your hands are gifts, Greta," he'd told her the night before she left for training. He only called her Greta when he was serious. "Treat them like jewels. Everything you'll ever do depends on them." She'd learned telegraph operation the way he'd taught her clockwork. Careful, patient, exact. By the time they sent her to a command post in Bavaria, she could tap out 45 words per minute in Morse code and read signals so faint other operators missed them entirely. Her commanding officer said she had the best hands in the unit. Now, in the overturned truck, those hands were trapped. The telegraph equipment had been a military-issue device, solid metal casing built to survive rough transport. When the truck rolled, it had shifted, pinning Margaret's right hand against the metal floor. The weight of it, combined with the weight of everything else sliding forward in the chaos, had crushed her fingers between steel and steel. She didn't scream right away. The shock was too complete. She saw her hand, saw the unnatural angles, saw blood pooling dark around the metal casing. Then the pain arrived like a delayed letter, and she screamed until her throat was raw. Someone pulled her out of the wreckage. She didn't see who. The world had become a blur of grey sky and smoke and faces that looked as terrified as she felt. Other soldiers from the convoy were climbing out of the truck, some limping, some helping others. One man wasn't moving at all, his neck bent wrong, his eyes open to nothing. Margaret sat in the mud beside the road. She didn't look at her hand. Couldn't. If she looked, it would become real. A German officer crouched beside her. He was young, maybe 25, with dirt on his face and exhaustion in his eyes. He glanced at her bandaged hand for a long moment. Then he looked away. "Es tut mir leid, Fräulein," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, miss." He didn't say what he was sorry for. He didn't have to. The American patrol found them 20 minutes later. They came around the bend in the road with their rifles ready, their jeeps painted olive drab, their faces hard with the caution of men who knew that desperation made people dangerous. But the fight was gone from the German soldiers scattered around the wrecked truck. They raised their hands. They surrendered. What else was there to do? Margaret barely registered the capture. The pain in her hand had become everything. A medic appeared, an American wearing a helmet with a red cross painted on the front. He knelt beside her and said something in English. She didn't understand the words, but his tone was professional, almost gentle. He cut away the torn sleeve of her uniform to check for other injuries. When he saw her hand, his expression changed. He called over his shoulder. Another soldier came, this one with sergeant's stripes and a weathered face. They had a quick conversation in English. The sergeant looked at Margaret's hand, looked at her face, then nodded once and walked away. The medic wrapped her hand in gauze and bandages, his movements quick but careful. He gave her something to bite down on a leather strap, then splinted her fingers against a piece of wood. The pain when he straightened the broken bones made her vision go white at the edges. When she could see again, he was tying off the bandages and saying something else she didn't understand. An older German prisoner, a man in his 40s with Iron Cross ribbons on his jacket, translated. "He says you need a surgeon. They're taking us to a collection point. There will be medical care there." Margareta wanted to ask what kind of medical care. Wanted to ask if they'd save her hand or just cut it off and be done with it. But her throat was too tight, and the world was tilting again, so she just nodded. They put her in the back of an American truck. Not roughly, not gently either, just efficiently, the way you'd load cargo that happened to breathe. She sat on a bench between two other German prisoners, women like herself, auxiliary service, telegraph operators and clerks and nurses who'd thought they were far enough from the front lines to be safe. The woman beside her was maybe 19, with blonde braids and hollow cheeks. She stared at Margaret's bandaged hand and whispered, "What will they do to you?" Margaret closed her eyes. "I don't know." But she did know. Or she thought she did. Everyone knew what happened to wounded prisoners. The stories had circulated through every unit passed along like warnings. The Americans were efficient, practical. They wouldn't waste resources on an enemy. If you were too injured to work, too broken to be worth feeding, they'd make quick decisions. A saw, a few minutes, problem solved. The truck rolled through the afternoon and into evening. The convoy was long, dozens of vehicles, hundreds of prisoners. They drove west, away from the collapsing front lines, away from the Russian advance that was making the American capture look like mercy by comparison. The landscape rolled past, burned-out farmhouses, cratered fields, the occasional corpse by the roadside already picked clean by crows. Margaret's hand throbbed with every heartbeat. The bandage was soaking through dark stains, spreading across the white gauze. She didn't look at it. Looking made it worse. Somehow made it more real. They stopped once for water. An American soldier handed out canteens moving down the line of prisoners. When he got to Margaret, he paused, looking at her hand. He said something to her in English. She shook her head, not understanding. He tried again, slower, then gave up, and just made sure she could drink one-handed. After he moved on, the older woman across from her, a stern-faced nurse named Frau Becker, leaned close. "You need to prepare yourself." "For what?" "For losing it." Frau Becker's voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel, just honest. She'd been a nurse at a military hospital before its capture. She knew wounds. That hand is dying. I can smell the infection starting already. The Americans won't waste medicine on a German. They'll take out a sore and remove it. That's what they do to prisoners. Another woman, younger, spoke up. My cousin was captured at Normandy. He said they let wounded Germans die, didn't even give them water. I heard they use prisoners for medical experiments, someone else added. Practice surgeries, they don't care if you survive. Frau Becker shook her head. Not experiments, just expedients. Why waste hours trying to save an enemy's hand when amputation takes minutes? It's logical. Marguerite felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, something deeper. Resignation, maybe. The war had been teaching resignation for years now. Cities bombed to ash, armies destroyed, families scattered. What was one hand compared to all that? But still, her hand. The hand that could read Morse code faster than anyone else in her unit. The hand that was supposed to build her future when the war finally ended and she could go home and work as a telegraph operator for the postal service. Something peaceful, something useful, something that didn't involve death and defeat and crushed fingers in the wreckage of a losing war. How long? She asked Frau Becker. Until they amputate a day, maybe two. Depends when we reach wherever they're taking us. Depends how busy their surgeons are with American casualties. You won't be a priority. The truck drove on. Day became night. They didn't stop except for fuel and guard changes. Margaret dozed sometimes, then woke to fresh waves of pain. The other prisoners slept or tried to. One woman cried quietly for hours. Another prayed in a whisper. Catholic prayers Margaret half remembered from childhood before her father stopped taking her to church. When dawn came, the landscape had changed. They weren't in Germany anymore. Margareta didn't know how she knew that, but she did. Something about the quality of light, maybe. Or the way the farms looked slightly different, more intact, less touched by the war's final thrashing. France, Frau Becker said, reading her expression. They're taking us west. Wherever they process prisoners, then probably a ship to America. She said it like it was obvious, like everyone knew that's where they'd end up. America. The word didn't seem real. America was where the enemy came from, the place that had sent an ocean of men and steel to crush the Reich. America was propaganda posters and stories of cruelty and everything the party had taught them to fear. But as the truck rolled through the French countryside, Margaret saw something that didn't match the propaganda. They passed a German prisoner work detail, men in Wehrmacht grey uniforms repairing a bridge under American guard. The prisoners looked tired, but not beaten. Not starving. One of them was smoking a cigarette, an American cigarette by the look of it, and joking with the guard. The guard was laughing. Margareta stared until the scene disappeared behind them. I saw that too, Frau Becker said quietly. A week ago. Different place. Same thing. They feed the prisoners. They don't beat them. I don't understand it. Propaganda, the younger woman with braids said firmly. They're trying to soften us, make us compliant. Then they'll show their true nature. But she didn't sound entirely convinced. The truck drove for 3 more days. They changed vehicles twice, transferred at processing camps where American soldiers checked papers and counted prisoners and moved them along like cattle through a stockyard. Margaret's hand got worse. The swelling spread up her wrist. The bandage smelled foul. Frau Becker changed it once with supplies from an American medic, and what lay beneath made both of them go silent. 2 of Margaret's fingers had turned black. Gangrene, Frau Becker said simply. It's spreading. You have maybe another day before it reaches a point where they'll have to take the whole arm to save your life. Margaret looked at her hand, at the fingers that had tapped out thousands of messages. They were dying. She was watching them die. Will it hurt? She asked. The amputation. They might give you something, ether if they have it. Maybe morphine, but probably not much. You're the enemy. Supplies are for Americans. So yes, it will hurt. Frau Becker didn't answer. She didn't need to. On the fourth day, they boarded a ship. Not a military vessel. A converted passenger liner, its paint grey now, its decks filled with prisoners and guards and the machinery of war. Margaret stood at the rail and watched Europe disappear behind them, watched the coast fade into mist. Somewhere back there was Munich, her father, her mother, her childhood bedroom where she'd practiced Morse code on a homemade telegraph key built from spare parts. She might never see any of it again. The Atlantic crossing took 9 days. The weather was rough. Half the prisoners got seasick. Margaret didn't. The pain in her hand was too consuming to leave room for nausea. An American Navy medic checked on her twice, changed her bandages, gave her pills that dulled the pain slightly, but made her thoughts fuzzy. He didn't speak German, and she didn't speak English, so they communicated in gestures and facial expressions. His expression when he looked at her hand said everything. When they finally reached land, America looked nothing like Margaret had imagined. She'd expected something harsh, industrial, hostile. Instead, she saw a harbour city with buildings that hadn't been bombed, streets with cars, people walking around like the war was something happening far away, which of course it was, for them. They took the prisoners off the ship in groups, loaded them onto trains. The trains had windows you could see out of which surprised Margaret. Why would you let prisoners see the countryside unless you wanted them to see it, unless you wanted them to understand something? What she saw through those windows broke something in her mind. Farms with full fields, towns without rubble, factories running their smokestacks puffing clean white steam, people on the streets who looked healthy, well-fed, going about their lives, children playing in parks, women hanging laundry that was actually clean, not grey rags patched together from curtains. This was the enemy country. This place that looked like it had never known what it felt like to eat wallpaper paste because there was no flour. This was the nation that propaganda said was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. Lies, Frau Becker whispered beside her. Everything they told us, all lies. The younger woman with braids was crying. My brothers died fighting this. For what? For a lie. Margaret said nothing. She just watched America roll past the window and felt her entire understanding of the world crack down the middle. The train travelled for 2 days, south and west. The landscape changed from green hills to flatlands to something vast and empty that an American guard called Texas when a prisoner asked. Texas was heat and dust and distances that seemed to go on forever. It was land that had never been fought over, never been shelled, never had armies pour across it like a flood. They arrived at the camp on April 28, 1945, Fort Sam Houston, a prisoner of war facility outside San Antonio. The gates opened and the train rolled through, and Margaret pressed her face to the window because what she was seeing couldn't be real. The camp had neat rows of barracks, trees planted for shade, a baseball diamond where German prisoners were playing an American game, their laughter carrying across the grounds. A swimming pool, an actual swimming pool with prisoners swimming in it guarded by American soldiers who looked more bored than hostile. Das ist nicht möglich, Margareta whispered. This isn't possible. But it was. They unloaded from the train. American soldiers processed them, checking names against lists assigning barracks. The soldiers weren't cruel, weren't kind either, just professional, doing a job. One of them noticed Margaret's bandaged hand and called over a medic. The medic took one look and said something urgent in English. Within minutes, Margaret was being led away from the processing line toward a building at the edge of the camp. A hospital, or what had been something else, maybe a stable or storage barn, now converted into a medical facility. They put her in a room with 6 beds. 3 were occupied, 2 American soldiers with various injuries, 1 German, a corporal with his left leg in a cast. The German was reading a book, an American book in English like he was learning the language. He looked up when Margareta was brought in and something changed in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or pity. She sat on the empty bed. A nurse appeared, an American woman in her 30s with red hair pulled back in a tight bun. She smiled and said something in English. When Margareta just stared, uncomprehending the nurse's smile, faltered. But she stayed gentle as she began to unwrap Margaret's hand. The bandages stuck to the wound. Peeling them away felt like being injured all over again. Margaret bit her lip until she tasted blood. When the last layer came away, the nurse made a small sound, almost a gasp. She turned and called out in English. Her voice was urgent. Margaret looked at her hand for the first time in days. It was worse than she'd feared. Her fingers had swollen to grotesque proportions. The skin was mottled purple and black, and a sick yellow-green that meant infection. The smell rose up sweet and rotten, the smell of flesh dying. 2 fingernails had fallen off. The bone fragment in her ring finger was more visible now, poking through skin that had started to turn grey at the edges. She was going to lose it. She knew that now, with absolute certainty. The only question was, how much? The hand, the forearm. How high would they cut to stop the infection? More people entered the room. Another nurse, a young doctor who took one look and started talking rapidly, an older soldier with medical insignia. They gathered around Margaret's bed, speaking English, gesturing at her hand. She caught the tone, if not the words. Serious, concerned, debating something. Then he arrived. Dr. Robert Hayes entered the room like a man who'd been awake for 3 days straight. Because he had been. Margaret would learn that later. 72 hours of continuous surgeries, American soldiers with wounds that needed immediate attention. 16 operations back-to-back, living on coffee and the kind of exhaustion that becomes its own form of clarity. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with grey hair at his temples, despite being only in his early 40s. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands were steady. He wore surgical scrubs under a white coat, and there were old bloodstains on the coat that laundering hadn't completely removed. He walked to Margaret's bed without a word, looked down at her, looked at her hand. His face showed nothing. Not disgust, not pity. Just assessment, clinical evaluation. Clinical. He lifted her hand gently, turned it, examined it from different angles. His touch was impersonal but not rough. When he pressed slightly on her index finger, she flinched. He nodded as if confirming something. He set her hand down carefully, turned to the other medical staff and spoke in English. His voice was quiet, measured. The conversation went back and forth for maybe 30 seconds. Then he turned back to Margaret. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her, not at the hand, but at her face, meeting her eyes. She saw the exhaustion in him. Saw something else too. Something she couldn't quite identify. Sadness, maybe. Or memory. He spoke in English. Margaret shook her head, helpless. The German corporal in the bed across the room cleared his throat. "Ich spreche English," he said. "I speak English." Dr. Hayes turned to him, said something. The corporal nodded, looked at Margaret. "He's asking if I can translate." "Yes," Margaret said. "Please." "Doctor." Hayes waited while the corporal shifted in his bed, getting comfortable. Then he began to speak, pausing after each sentence for translation. "I'm Dr. Robert Hayes. I'm the chief surgeon for this facility. I've examined your hand." Pause. Translation. "The damage is severe. Multiple compound fractures. Significant soft tissue trauma. Advanced infection with necrosis, progressing to the second knuckles." Margaret felt cold. The medical terms were mostly universal. She understood enough. Dr. Hayes continued. "Standard protocol for an injury like this is immediate amputation below the wrist. That would prevent the infection from spreading. It would save your life." There it was. The confirmation. Margaret felt something in her chest, a kind of hollow resignation. She'd known this was coming, had known since the accident, Still, hearing it spoken aloud was different. "However," Dr. Hayes said, and something in his tone made Margaret look up sharply. "I believe there's a chance I can save your hand." The corporal translated, then paused. "Did he say, save?" "That's what he said." The corporal looked as confused as Margaret felt. Dr. Hayes was still speaking. "It would require approximately 4 hours of surgery, maybe longer. The success rate for this type of procedure under field conditions is low, perhaps 30%. If the infection has spread deeper than I can see, or if complications arise during surgery, I'll have to amputate immediately anyway." He paused. Let the translation catch up. "The recovery would be long and painful. There's no guarantee you'll regain full function even if the surgery succeeds. You might keep the hand, but lose the ability to use it properly." Another pause. Margaret's mind was struggling to process what she was hearing. "Why?" she asked. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Why would you try to save it? I'm your enemy." The corporal translated. Dr. Hayes was silent for a moment. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph, held it where Margaret could see. The photo showed a man in civilian clothes standing in a workshop. A cluttered bench behind him covered with tiny gears and springs and watch parts. Tools hung on the wall, each in its precise place. The man had the same careful hands, the same patient eyes that her father had. "That's my father," Dr. Hayes said through the translator. "He was a watchmaker in Philadelphia. He taught me that some things are worth the extra effort, that precision matters, that just because something is difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't try." He put the photo away. "When I saw your hand, I saw a different photograph. It fell from your pocket when they brought you in." He nodded to the nurse. She produced another photograph, one Margaret had forgotten she was carrying, the one of her father in his shop, standing at his workbench, surrounded by clocks. Dr. Hayes looked at both photographs, at Margareta. "I'm going to try to save your hand, Miss Schneider, not because it's easy, not because protocol requires it, but because someone who looks at your photo the way you look at mine would want me to try." Margaret felt tears starting. She fought them back. "What if it doesn't work?" "Then you lose the hand anyway. But at least we tried." "Why?" she asked again. "You're a surgeon for the American Army. Why spend 4 hours on an enemy when you could spend that time on your own men?" Dr. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost distant. "I had a daughter, Emily. She was 9 years old when she died. Polio. It took her hands first, made them useless. She asked me why I couldn't fix them. 'I'm a surgeon,' she said. 'I fix everyone. Why can't I fix her?' He met Margaret's eyes. "I couldn't. The disease was too advanced. I had to watch her lose the ability to hold a spoon, to write her name, to do anything that required those small, precise movements that make us human." Silence in the room. Even the corporal translator looked stricken. "So, yes, Miss Schneider, I'm going to spend 4 hours trying to save your hand, because somewhere someone loves you the way I loved my daughter. And maybe if I can give you back what I couldn't give Emily, that means something." Margaret couldn't stop the tears now. They ran down her face and she didn't care. "When?" she managed to ask. Dr. Hayes checked his watch. "The operating room is being prepared now. We'll start at 6 o'clock this evening. That gives you time to rest, to eat something. You'll need your strength." "What do I need to do?" "Just don't give up," he said. "The surgery will be long and difficult. There will be moments when I have to make decisions, when I'll have to choose between trying to save one more finger or settling for 3 good ones instead of 5 damaged ones. I need you to trust me to make those choices." Margaret nodded slowly. "I trust you." "Good." Dr. Hayes turned to leave, then stopped, looked back. "One more thing. Your ring, the silver one on your ring finger. We'll have to cut it off before surgery." Margaret's hand went instinctively to the ring, her mother's wedding band, the last piece of home she had with her. "Can't you work around it?" The finger is too swollen. The ring is cutting off circulation. If we leave it, you'll definitely lose that finger." She looked at the ring, at her dying hand, at Dr. Hayes's tired, serious face. "Cut it off," she said. "Save the finger. My mother would understand." Dr. Hayes nodded. "I'll do my best." He left. The other medical staff followed. The room fell quiet, except for the sound of one of the American soldiers snoring softly in his bed. The German corporal across the room spoke. "My name is Thomas Fischer. I was a teacher before the war, Hamburg. Margarete Schneider. Margarete, Munich, telegraph operator." "He saved my arm," Thomas said quietly, gesturing to his cast. 3 weeks ago, I had shrapnel embedded near the brachial artery. Standard protocol was amputation. He spent 7 hours removing the fragments. Everyone thought he was crazy, but I still have my arm. He shifted in his bed, meeting her eyes. "He'll try for your hand, Margaret. He really will try. Whether he succeeds, that's up to God and surgery and how much your body can endure. But he'll try." Margaret looked at her hand, at the black fingers and the infection spreading and the bone showing through torn skin. In 7 hours, she'd be in an operating room. An enemy surgeon would be cutting into her flesh, trying to save what everyone said was already lost. She didn't know if she believed in miracles anymore. The war had beaten that out of most people. But maybe she didn't need a miracle. Maybe she just needed a man who remembered his daughter. A watchmaker's son who understood that some things were worth the extra effort. Maybe that would be enough. Outside, the Texas sun was setting. The barracks cast long shadows across the camp. Somewhere prisoners were eating dinner. Somewhere guards were changing shifts. Somewhere the war was still happening, still grinding up lives and futures, and everything people thought they knew about the world. But in this room, in this moment, there was only a young woman with a dying hand, and the fragile, impossible hope that she might keep it. The nurse returned with food, soup and bread. Margaret could only eat left-handed, awkward and slow. The soup was warm, real vegetables. The bread was soft, not the hard grey stuff that had become standard in Germany. She ate in silence, thinking about her father, about clockwork and precision. In 4 hours she'd find out if those lessons meant anything. In 4 hours the cutting would begin. The clock on the wall said 4:47 p.m. Margaret watched the second hand tick forward. Each movement felt deliberate, like the mechanism was considering whether to continue. She understood that feeling. Her right hand lay on top of the thin hospital blanket, still wrapped in fresh bandages the nurse had applied after Dr. Hayes left. Underneath the white gauze, 5 fingers were slowly dying. In 73 minutes, someone would try to stop that death, or finish it quickly with a saw. She closed her eyes, tried to rest like Dr. Hayes had instructed. But rest required a calm mind, and hers kept returning to the same thought, circling it like water around a drain. She was going to lose her hand. Despite what the doctor said, despite his kind words about his daughter and his father's watchmaking, the reality was simple. You couldn't save flesh that had already turned black. You couldn't reverse gangrene with hope and good intentions. The door opened. Margaret opened her eyes. It wasn't Dr. Hayes. It was the red-haired nurse, the one who'd gasped when she first unwrapped Margaret's hand. She carried a tray, and the smell that came with her made Margaret's stomach clench with something between hunger and nausea. "Miss Schneider," the nurse said in English, setting the tray on the small table beside the bed. She gestured at the food, then at Margaret, miming eating. Her smile was professional, practiced the kind nurses learned to wear when they wanted patients to comply without argument. Margaret stared at the tray, stared at what was on it. Thomas Fischer, the translator, cleared his throat from his bed across the room. "She says you need to eat. Doctor's orders. You haven't had real food in days, and the surgery will require strength." "I'm not hungry," Margaret said. It was a lie. She was starving. Had been starving for months, if she was honest. The last year of the war had made hunger as constant as breathing. "Doesn't matter," Thomas replied. doctor. Hayes was very specific. You eat, or he delays the surgery. The nurse was still standing there waiting. Her expression had shifted from professional smile to something more serious. She said something else in English. She says if you don't eat, your body will be too weak to survive the anesthesia, much less 4 hours of surgery. You'll die on the table. Not from the hand, from malnutrition and shock. Margareta looked at the tray again. Really looked at it this time. 6 strips of bacon. Thick cut, glistening with rendered fat, their edges caramelized to a dark brown that was almost black but not quite. 3 scrambled eggs, butter yellow, still steaming slightly soft curds that looked like they'd been cooked with cream. 2 pieces of toast golden brown with butter melting into the bread and strawberry jam in a small glass dish beside them. A cup of coffee black with real cream in a separate container. A glass of milk so white it looked almost blue in the afternoon light. It was more food than Margaret had seen in one place in over a year, maybe 2 years. Certainly since the rationing had gotten bad, since the supply lines had collapsed, since Germany had started eating itself from the inside out. "I can't," she whispered. "You have to," Thomas said. His voice was gentle but firm. "I know what you're thinking. I thought the same thing when they fed me. But you need to understand something. This isn't a trick. This isn't cruelty. This is just how they eat here. This is breakfast for them. Standard. Normal. That's impossible. And yet," he gestured at his own empty tray on the table beside his bed, "I had the same meal this morning, and yesterday morning, and the morning before that. They have so much food here, Margaret. So much they can give it to prisoners without a second thought." The nurse said something else. She picked up one of the bacon strips and held it out to Margaret. Slowly, Margaret reached out with her left hand, took the bacon. It was still warm. The fat made her fingers slick. She brought it to her mouth, hesitated, then bit. The world stopped. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. The world actually seemed to pause, everything going still and silent, except for the sensation exploding across her tongue. Salt hit first. Pure, clean salt, the kind you could taste individually, not the bitter chemical substitute they'd been using in Germany for the past 2 years. Then, fat. Rich coating, the kind of fat that came from an animal that had been fed corn and grain, not starved, and worked until its meat was grey and stringy. Then smoke. Deep wood-fired smoke that spoke of time and patience and resources to waste on making food taste good instead of just keeping people alive. And underneath all of that, impossibly a sweetness. The pork itself had a subtle sugar note, the way meat does when it comes from a healthy animal, when the fat has had time to marble properly through the muscle. Margaret chewed slowly. The bacon was crispy at the edges but tender in the center. It melted. Actually melted on her tongue, breaking down into components coating her mouth like warm silk. She could feel it sliding down her throat, could feel her body recognizing it as something it desperately needed. She swallowed, closed her eyes. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, there was no war, no crushed hand, no operating room waiting, no dead cities or collapsed armies or futures that had been cancelled, just bacon. Just the memory of what food used to be before the world caught fire. Then the guilt arrived. It came like a physical force slamming into her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her eyes snapped open. She looked at the bacon in her hand, at the 5 remaining strips on the plate, and felt something twist in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. Her mother was in Munich, if Munich still existed. If the firebombing that everyone whispered about hadn't already turned the city to ash. Her mother, who in her last letter, the one that had arrived 6 months ago, had written about eating potato peels, boiling them in water to make them soft enough to chew, searching for acorns in the parks, grinding them into flour that was so bitter it made your throat close up. "Your father tries to make bread from them," her mother had written in that careful script. "But they're terrible, Greta, bitter and hard, and they make us sick, but we eat them because there's nothing else." That had been November, 6 months ago. What were they eating now? In April, with the Red Army closing in from the east and the Americans from the west, with the supply chains completely broken and the party officials fleeing with whatever food remained, tree bark probably. That's what people ate in sieges. Margaret had read about it in school, learning about the 30 Years' War, about cities that held out until the population was eating leather and roots and anything that wouldn't immediately kill them. Her mother was eating tree bark, and Margaret was sitting in a Texas hospital, an enemy prisoner, eating bacon. She picked up the second strip anyway, because her body didn't care about guilt. Her body only knew that it was starving, that it had been pushed to the edge of what it could endure, and that this food represented survival. She bit into the second piece. It tasted like shame. She chewed slowly, each movement of her jaw a small betrayal. She swallowed, and it felt like pushing glass down her throat. The third piece tasted like failure. The fourth, like selfishness. The fifth, she could barely taste at all through the tears that were now running down her face. "Meine Mutter isst Baumrinde," she whispered. "My mother eats tree bark. Ich esse Speck." "I eat bacon." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "I know. I thought about my family too. About my wife and my son in Hamburg. About what they must be eating if they're eating at all. The guilt it's unbearable sometimes." "Then how do you stand it?" "I don't. I just carry it. And I eat anyway because Dr. Hayes told me the same thing he told you. You need strength to survive. Your family would want you to survive." He paused. "Also, I asked him once why they feed us like this, why they give prisoners food that many Americans probably don't eat this well." "What did he say?" "He said, because you're human first." Thomas's voice held something like wonder. "Just that. No politics. No strategy. Just because we're human." Margareta looked at the sixth strip of bacon, picked it up, ate it. It tasted like confusion, like everything she'd been taught about the enemy dissolving with each bite. The Americans were supposed to be cruel, wasteful, weak, decadent. That's what the propaganda said, what the party had drilled into everyone for 12 years. But the Americans she'd seen so far had given her medical care, had put her in a room with their own wounded soldiers, had assigned her a surgeon who was willing to spend 4 hours trying to save an enemy's hand. And now they were feeding her bacon like it was nothing, like they had so much abundance they could spare it for people who'd been trying to kill them just weeks ago. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. The world was supposed to work one way, and it kept insisting on working another way entirely. She moved to the eggs. The scrambled eggs were impossibly soft, almost liquid, cooked with butter and cream, until they were more custard than solid. She ate them with the toast, each bite a study in contrasts. The eggs were rich and mild. The toast was crispy and sweet from the jam. Together they made something that tasted like peace, like Sunday mornings before the war, like being human instead of just surviving. She drank the milk. It was cold, fresh, tasting faintly of grass and clean dairy barns. She added cream to the coffee and drank that too, feeling the caffeine start to cut through the fog of pain and exhaustion. When she finished, the plate was empty. Her stomach was full for the first time in longer than she could remember. She felt simultaneously stronger and more ashamed than she'd ever felt in her life. The nurse collected the tray, said something approving in English, patted Margaret's shoulder gently before leaving. Thomas spoke again. "There's something else you need to know. Something I learned while I've been here." "What?" "We were lied to about everything. The propaganda, the news, all of it. Lies." "I know. I saw the cities from the train. They're not bombed. They're not starving. They're just living. It's more than that." Thomas shifted in his bed, his face serious. "I've been talking to the guards, learning English, reading their newspapers. Do you know what we were told about American military strength, about their production capacity? That they were weak, inefficient, that they couldn't match German engineering. They built more tanks in 1944 than Germany built in the entire war. More planes in 6 months than we built in 6 years. They have so much industrial capacity that they can afford to feed prisoners bacon and eggs because food is one thing they have too much of. He shook his head. We were fighting a country that could bury us in steel and still have enough left over to be generous with the survivors, and nobody told us. Nobody told us we never had a chance. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, a structure she'd built her entire adult life on the certainty that Germany was right, that the cause was just, that the sacrifices meant something. It was breaking. Had been breaking since she saw the farms through the train window, since she saw the swimming pool in the POW camp, since Dr. Hayes looked at her hand and decided to try. "What do we do now?" she asked. "If everything we believed was a lie, what do we do?" "Survive," Thomas said simply. "That's all. We survive, and maybe we get to go home eventually, and maybe we try to build something better than what we had before." The door opened again. Different nurse this time, younger, maybe 25. She gestured to Margaret. "Time." Margaret stood. Her legs were shaky from the food, or the fear, or both. The nurse steadied her, guided her out of the room and down a hallway. Thomas called after her, "Good luck, Margaret." "I'll see you on the other side." The hallway seemed longer than it should have been. They passed other rooms, other patients, American soldiers with bandaged heads and missing limbs with the hollow eyes of men who'd seen too much. They passed German prisoners working as orderlies, mopping floors, changing sheets, doing the tasks that kept a hospital functioning. They reached a door marked "Surgery" in English and German both. The nurse pushed it open. The operating room had been a chemistry classroom once. You could still see the outline on the wall where a periodic table had hung. The space had been transformed, but traces of its former purpose remained. The large windows that had once let in natural light for students were now covered with blackout curtains. The demonstration bench had been replaced with an operating table, steel and leather, and built to hold a human body still while people cut into it. Dr. Hayes was already there, scrubbing his hands at a large sink in the corner. He wore full surgical garb, now green scrubs cap, mask hanging around his neck. His hands moved in a practiced pattern soap and water and methodical attention to each finger, each nail bed, each line in his palm. 2 other figures were in the room. A younger doctor, maybe 30, setting up equipment by the operating table, and another nurse, older, laying out surgical instruments on a cloth-covered tray. Margaret saw the instruments and felt her heart start to race. Scalpels, bone saws, clamps and retractors and things whose purpose she couldn't identify, but which all looked capable of causing terrible pain. Dr. Hayes finished scrubbing, turned, saw Margaret and nodded. He said something in English. The nurse who'd brought Margaret translated her German, heavily accented but clear enough. "He asks if you ate." "Yes." "Good. Now we need to get you on the table. The anesthesia doctor will explain your options." The younger doctor approached. He had kind eyes above his mask. He spoke slowly, and the nurse translated. "I'm Dr. Patterson. I handle anesthesia. For a surgery this long, we usually use ether or chloroform. Full unconsciousness. You won't feel anything, won't remember anything. But I understand from Dr. Hayes that you want to be awake." Margaret swallowed hard. "I need to know if he's cutting it off. I need to know." Dr. Patterson exchanged a look with Dr. Hayes. A conversation passed between them without words. Finally, Dr. Patterson nodded. "We can do nerve blocks. 3 injections that will numb your entire arm. You'll feel pressure but no pain. However, you'll be conscious for 4 hours. You'll hear everything, see some things if you look. Most patients find that traumatic." "I don't care. I need to be awake." "All right. But if at any point it becomes too much, if your blood pressure spikes or you start to go into shock, I'm putting you under completely. Non-negotiable. Understood?" "Understood." They helped her onto the table. The leather was cool against her back. They positioned her right arm on an extension palm, up, fingers splayed, strapped down her torso, her left arm, her legs. Not cruelly, just securely. So she couldn't move during the surgery, couldn't interfere with the delicate work. Dr. Patterson prepared 3 syringes, long needles that looked like they belonged in nightmares. "This is going to hurt," he said through the translator. "Each injection will feel like fire running up your arm, but then the numbness will come and you won't feel anything else." He wasn't lying about the pain. The first injection went into her armpit, targeting the brachial plexus. It felt like he'd injected lightning. Margaret gasped, bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. The second injection higher up near her shoulder was worse. The third near her collarbone made her vision white out at the edges. But then slowly the feeling drained from her arm. It happened in stages. First warmth, then tingling, then nothing. She watched Dr. Patterson pinch her fingertips with forceps, watched him press hard. She saw it happening but felt nothing at all. "Good," he said. "You're ready." Dr. Hayes approached the table. He positioned himself beside her arm, adjusted the overhead light so it focused directly on her hand. The nurse cut away the bandages with surgical scissors. The smell rose up immediately. Sweet rot mixed with carbolic acid. Infection and antiseptic fighting for dominance. Hayes examined the exposed hand with the same careful attention he'd shown earlier. He spoke to the other nurse who was taking notes. Medical terminology spoken quickly, most of it incomprehensible to Margaret. But she caught words. Necrosis, septicemia, compound fracture. Thomas Fisher appeared at the head of the table. He was in a wheelchair pushed by an orderly. "I volunteered to translate," he said to Margaret. "Dr. Hayes agreed. Thought you might want a familiar voice." "Thank you," Margaret managed. Her mouth was dry. Her heart was hammering so hard she could see her hospital gown moving with each beat. Dr. Hayes picked up a scalpel, held it in the light, checking the blade. Then he looked at Margaret, spoke in English. Thomas translated. "I'm going to start by removing the dead tissue. This is called debridement. It's the most important part. If I can get all the infected flesh out, the rest has a chance. If the infection has gone deeper than I can see if it's in the bone marrow or the deep tissue layers, then we're done. I'll amputate and we'll call it a day." "Understood." Margaret nodded. Couldn't speak. Her voice had disappeared somewhere. "I need you to do something for me," Hayes continued. "Don't watch. Don't. Turn your head to the left. Look at Thomas. Talk to him if you want, or just stay quiet. But don't watch what I'm doing. It won't help, and it might make this harder for both of us." She wanted to refuse, wanted to insist on seeing everything. But something in his voice made her comply. She turned her head left away from her arm, looked at Thomas's face instead. Dr. Hayes made the first cut. Margaret felt pressure, a sense of something happening to her hand, but distant, muffled, like it was happening to someone else. She heard sounds, though. The scalpel cutting through tissue, the scrape of metal on bone. Dr. Hayes breathing steadily, talking to his nurse in that same calm, clinical voice. "Necrotic tissue here extending to the proximal phalanx, removing. Careful of the tendon. Can you see it? Good. Cauterize that bleeder." A smell like burning meat. The cautery iron sealing off blood vessels. Margaret's stomach lurched, but she kept it down. Thomas started talking. Maybe to distract her, maybe to distract himself. "Tell me about Munich. What was it like before the war?" Margaret grabbed onto the question like a rope. "Beautiful, especially in winter. My father's shop was near the Marienplatz. You could hear the glockenspiel play every day at noon. I've been to Munich, once before the war, 1936, for the Olympics. I saw some of the events, the gymnastics. They talked about cities and childhood and things that seemed impossibly far away. And while they talked, Dr. Hayes cut away dead flesh from Margaret's hand. She heard him working, heard the nurse counting instruments, heard the younger Dr. Patterson calling out her vital signs every few minutes. Blood pressure stable, heart rate elevated but acceptable. She's doing well. Time stopped having meaning. Margaret had no idea if they'd been there for 20 minutes or 2 hours. The conversation with Thomas meandered through topics like a stream finding its path. School, books, music. Anything but the war. anything but what was happening to her hand. Then Dr. Hayes's voice changed, got more tense. I've got exposed bone here. Index finger metacarpal shaft. Fracture is complicated. 3 fragments. This is going to take a while. More sounds. Different now. Metallic clicking. The rasp of a file on bone. Thomas kept talking, but Margareta had stopped listening. She was trying to interpret the sounds, trying to understand what they meant about her future. Compound fracture, multiple fragments, but wait, look at this. The periosteum is intact. That's good. That's very good. If we can align these pieces correctly. Hayes's voice trailed off into concentration. Margaret heard him breathing through his nose, steady and controlled. Heard the tiny sounds of surgical wire being threaded through bone. Heard him say, steady, steady, almost there. Perfect. Hold that position while I secure it. The nurse said something in English. Hayes replied sharply, not angry, just intense, focused to the point where normal politeness disappeared. More time passed. Margaret's neck started to ache from holding her head turned to the left. Her back hurt from lying still on the hard table. But she didn't move, didn't complain, because Dr. Hayes was somewhere beyond the edge of her vision, trying to rebuild her hand, one bone fragment at a time. Dr. Hayes? That was Patterson, the anesthesiologist. His voice had an edge. We're approaching hour 2. How much longer? I don't know. I'm working as fast as I can. Her blood pressure is starting to climb. Stress response. If it gets much higher, I'm putting her under. Give me 30 more minutes. 20. Then I make the call. Margaret spoke for the first time in an hour. Don't put me under, please. Hayes's voice came from beyond her line of sight. Margaret, listen to me. If Dr. Patterson says you need to be unconscious, you go unconscious. This is non-negotiable. Your safety comes before your awareness. Understood. But understood. She closed her eyes. Understood. Good. Now be quiet and let me work. I'm at a very delicate part. Silence fell. Thomas had stopped talking. Everyone was holding their breath, it seemed. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could hear the tick of a clock somewhere in the room, could hear Dr. Hayes's breathing slower now, the breathing of a man who'd entered a state of complete concentration. Then suddenly a different sound. Liquid, splashing, the nurse's urgent voice. Bleeder arterial. I see it. Clamp. Now. Fast movement, the sound of metal on metal. Dr. Hayes's voice still calm, but with an undercurrent of intensity. Got it. Okay. Okay. That was the radial artery. Must have been nicked by a bone fragment. It's clamped. Let me ligate it. Silk suture, 4-0. More sounds. Margaret's vision was starting to blur at the edges. Whether from stress or tears, or the prolonged position, she couldn't tell. Dr. Hayes. Patterson again. Blood pressure, 160/95 and climbing. That's my limit. 5 more minutes. Now, doctor. I'm not asking. Hayes made a sound of frustration. Fine. Put her under. But slowly. I need her stable, not crashed. Understood. Patterson appeared in Margaret's field of vision. He held a different syringe now. I'm going to give you something to sleep. When you wake up, it will be over, one way or another. Wait. Margaret's voice was weak. Is he still trying? Is he still trying to save it? Patterson looked over his shoulder at something she couldn't see. Yes, he's still trying. Then let me stay awake. Please, I can handle it. Your blood pressure says otherwise. Please. Patterson hesitated, looked at Dr. Hayes. A silent conversation. Then Patterson sighed. If I give you something to lower your blood pressure, something to calm your nervous system, can you promise to stay quiet, not to move, not to interfere? Yes, I promise. All right. Against my better judgment, but all right. He injected something into her IV line. This will make you feel calm, detached. You might not care very much about what's happening. That's normal. That's what it's supposed to do. The medication hit fast. Warmth spread from her arm through her chest. The fear that had been clutching her heart released its grip. Everything became distant, soft-edged, less urgent. She could still hear, still think, but the panic was gone, replaced by a dreamy sort of acceptance. She heard Dr. Hayes return to work, heard the careful sounds of reconstruction, heard him talking to himself now, or maybe to the nurse, a running commentary of what he was finding, what he was doing. Middle finger tendon severed clean. Good. Clean cuts heal better than tears. I can reattach this. Need to find both ends. There's one. Where's the... There. Good. This is going to take a while. Someone time me. I want to know how long this takes. Starting timer, the nurse said. Thread the tendon ends onto the needle, like this. See, now we bring them together. Not too tight. Natural tension. That's it. First suture. 1 down, 11 to go. Margaret floated in the warm fog of the medication. Time became meaningless again. She existed in a space where her hand was both attached to her and separate from her, where Dr. Hayes was working on something that mattered intensely, but also didn't matter at all, where past and present and future collapsed into one eternal moment of lying on a table while someone tried to fix what was broken. Ring finger, Hayes said, and something in his voice made Margaret pull herself back from the fog. This is bad. This is really bad. The bone fragment came through the skin. High infection risk, and the tendon is tendon. It's not severed. It's crushed. I can't repair crushed tissue. Silence. Long silence. Margaret held her breath. Options. Hayes was talking to himself now. I can remove the finger. That's the safe choice. 4 good fingers are better than 5 compromised ones, or I can try to work with what's here, try to salvage enough tendon to maintain some function. Margaret might end up with a finger that barely moves, a finger that hurts constantly, a finger that's more burden than benefit. More silence. What would my father do? Hayes whispered. Margaret barely heard it. What would he do if this was a watch? Would he discard the broken part, or try to make it work? The nurse said something soft in English. You're right, Hayes replied. He'd try. He always tried. Louder now, more certain. We're keeping the finger. All 5 stay. Even if they don't work perfectly, we try. And he went back to work with renewed intensity. The hours blurred together. Margaret drifted in and out of awareness. Sometimes she was on the table. Sometimes she was back in Munich in her father's shop, watching him repair a pocket watch with movements so small she could barely see them. Sometimes she was at her telegraph station, her fingers flying over the key, sending messages that might mean life or death to someone somewhere. At some point she realized she was humming. A song from childhood. A lullaby her mother used to sing. Guten Abend, gute Nacht. Dr. Hayes's hands stopped moving. Margaret felt it more than saw it. A pause in the rhythm of surgery. Thomas's voice very quiet. She's singing. Should I tell her to stop? Hayes's voice even quieter. No, let her sing. So Margaret sang or hummed, barely aware she was doing it. The song her mother had sung when she was small, when the world was safe, when hands were for holding and not for getting crushed in truck accidents. She heard someone else make a sound, a catch in breath, a suppressed sob. She managed to turn her head slightly, breaking her promise to look away. Saw Dr. Hayes standing over her arm, his hands still, his eyes closed behind his surgical mask. Saw wetness on his cheeks. Emily, he whispered. She used to sing that song. The moment stretched. Then Hayes opened his eyes, wiped his face on his shoulder, picked up his instruments again. All right, let's finish this. We're almost there. The final hour was closing stitches, layer after layer, deep tissue, fascia, muscle, skin. Margareta heard Hayes counting under his breath, heard the nurse confirming counts of sponges and instruments, heard Patterson saying her vital signs were stable, now good, she'd made it through the worst. Last suture, Hayes said. His voice was hoarse with exhaustion. And done. Bandaging. Nurse splints for all 5 fingers. Gauze wrapping not too tight. We need to watch for swelling. Cool pressure on Margaret's hand as they wrapped it. She still couldn't feel anything through the nerve blocks, but she could sense the change, the weight of bandages, the restriction of splints. "How does it look?" she asked. Her voice was slurred from the medication. Hayes came into her field of vision. His mask was down now. His face was grey with fatigue, but his eyes were clear. "All 5 fingers are still attached. The bones are set. The tendons are repaired. The infection is cleaned out as much as I can clean it. Now we wait." "Wait for what?" 72 hours. If you don't develop a fever, if the tissue shows signs of recovery, if the swelling goes down instead of up, then you get to keep your hand. And if not, then we amputate below the wrist and count ourselves lucky we saved your forearm." He paused. "But I think you're going to make it, Margaret. I think all 5 fingers are going to survive." "Why? What makes you think that?" Hayes pulled off his surgical gloves, dropped them in a bin, rubbed his face with both hands. "Because I just spent 4 hours and 23 minutes fighting for them, and I don't intend to lose that fight now." They wheeled her back to her room. Thomas was already there, back in his bed, smiling when he saw her. "You still have it? Your hand?" Margaret looked at the white mass of bandages at the end of her right arm. Couldn't see her fingers, couldn't feel them. But they were there, all 5 of them, still attached, still hers. "I still have it," she said. And then finally, she let herself cry. Not from pain, not from fear, but from something more complicated. Relief and confusion and guilt and gratitude all mixed together. She'd eaten bacon while her mother starved. She'd been saved by the enemy who bombed her city. She'd been given back her future by a man who'd lost his daughter. None of it made sense. The world was supposed to be simple, good and evil, us and them. But lying in that hospital bed in Texas with her hand wrapped in bandages and her stomach full of food and a surgeon's exhausted face in her memory, Margaret understood that the world had never been simple. It had just been a lie that was easier to believe. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky turned orange and purple colors that looked the same in Texas as they did in Munich. Inside, Margaret closed her eyes and tried to sleep. In 3 days, she'd know if the hand would live. In 3 days, she'd know if Dr. Hayes's 4 hours had been enough. For now, there was only waiting, and the ghost sensation of fingers that might or might not still be hers. The fever came on the 2nd night. Margaret woke at 3 a.m. with her skin on fire and her thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. The room was dark except for a small lamp the night nurse kept burning at the desk by the door. Margaret tried to call out, but her throat was too dry. She managed to sound something between a whimper and a cough. The nurse was there in seconds. Cool hand on Margaret's forehead. Sharp intake of breath. Rapid words in English that Margaret's fever-scrambled brain couldn't begin to process. The nurse disappeared, came back with a thermometer, stuck it under Margaret's tongue, waited, pulled it out and her face went tight. She left again. This time, when she came back, Dr. Hayes was with her. He looked like he'd been asleep in his office. His hair stuck up at odd angles, his eyes were bloodshot, but his hands were steady as he pulled back the blanket and began unwrapping Margaret's bandages. "What's her temperature?" he asked. 103.2, the nurse replied. Hayes swore under his breath, kept unwrapping. The bandages seemed to go on forever, layer after layer of white gauze that Margaret didn't remember being this thick. Finally, he reached the last layer, paused, then removed it. The smell hit immediately. Sickly sweet decay, barely masked by sulfur drugs. Hayes leaned close, examining each finger in the dim light. Margaret tried to see, but her vision kept blurring. Everything had a halo around it, like looking through water. "Talk to me," she managed to whisper in German. Hayes looked up. For a moment she thought he wouldn't understand, that Thomas wasn't here to translate that she'd die without knowing if she still had her hand. Then Hayes spoke. Slow, careful German with an American accent that mangled half the words but got the meaning across. "Infection spreading. Not as bad as I feared. but bad enough. He switched back to English, talking to the nurse. Start her on sulfur drugs, double dose. Ice packs on the hand to bring down local inflammation. And get me a syringe. I need to drain the abscess in the ring finger. The nurse moved fast. Hayes kept examining the hand, his face a mask of concentration. Margaret's thoughts were slipping away from her, falling into fever dreams. She saw her mother standing in the ruins of Munich. Saw her father's watch shop burning. Saw Emily, Dr. Hayes's daughter, though she'd never seen a photograph of the girl sitting at a piano with hands that wouldn't move. "Papa," she mumbled. "I broke it. I'm sorry. I broke the watch." Hayes's voice came from very far away. "You didn't break anything, Margaret. Stay with me. Focus on my voice." But she was already gone, sinking into fever like sinking into dark water. When consciousness returned, the room was bright with morning sun. Margaret's mouth tasted like copper and ash. Her head felt stuffed with wool, but the fire in her skin had diminished to a dull warmth. Thomas Fisher was in the chair beside her bed. He was reading a book, but looked up when she stirred. "Welcome back," he said. "You've been out for 18 hours. My hand, still attached. Dr. Hayes says the fever broke around dawn. He's been here the entire time, only left about an hour ago when the day shift forced him to get some sleep." Margareta tried to sit up. The room tilted, but Thomas helped her, adjusting pillows behind her back. She looked at her right arm. Fresh bandages, less bulky than before. Her fingers were splinted, individually immobilized but visible. "He drained an infection pocket last night," Thomas continued. "Said it was touch and go for a while, but the sulfur drugs are working. The swelling is already going down." "How can you tell?" "The bandages are looser. See, yesterday they were tight enough to leave marks. Today there's space." He paused. "He also said, if you make it another 48 hours without the fever returning, you're probably going to keep all 5 fingers. Probably, not certainly. But probably was more than Margareta had dared hope for 3 days ago. The door opened. Nurse Kelly, the red-haired one, entered with a breakfast tray. She smiled when she saw Margaret awake, said something cheerful in English. Set the tray down on the bedside table. Margaret looked at the food. Scrambled eggs again. Toast. But this time there was also a chocolate bar. A Hershey's bar, brown wrapper, with silver lettering. "What's this?" she asked Thomas. "Special occasion. Germany surrendered yesterday. May 8th. The war in Europe is over." Thomas's voice was flat, emotionless. "The nurses are giving out chocolate to celebrate." The war was over. Germany had lost. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd believed in, everything that had cost Margaret her hand and Thomas his freedom and millions of people their lives, it was finished. Done. Lost. She should feel something. Grief, maybe. Or relief. But there was only a hollow numbness, like all her emotions had been burned away by fever. She picked up the chocolate bar with her left hand. The wrapper crinkled. She'd forgotten what chocolate sounded like. "They're celebrating outside," Thomas said quietly. "American flags everywhere, music, beer. The guards invited some of the German prisoners to join. Can you imagine celebrating with the enemy, celebrating our defeat?" Margareta broke off one square of chocolate, brought it to her mouth. It melted instantly on her tongue. Sweet, creamy, rich beyond anything she'd tasted in years. The cocoa butter coated her mouth like velvet. She tasted milk, sugar, vanilla. Impossible luxuries that spoke of a country that had never known real hunger. She ate another square, then another. Each one a small surrender. Each one an acknowledgement that the world she'd known was gone and something else was taking its place. "My family doesn't know if I'm alive," she said. The chocolate turned to sand in her mouth. "They're somewhere in Germany if they survived the bombings, if they survived the Russians, if they survived the starvation. They're eating whatever they can find. And I'm sitting here eating chocolate in Texas." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Dr. Hayes told me something. After he operated on you. He said he flew bombing missions over Germany. 1943. Munich was one of his targets." Margareta's hand stopped halfway to her mouth. "What? He said he dropped incendiary bombs on your city. Fire bombs, the ones that turned whole neighborhoods to ash. Thomas's voice was careful, gentle. He said, when he saw your hand, when he saw that photograph of your father's shop, he thought maybe he could build something instead of just destroying. Maybe he could save one person from Munich instead of burning 1,000. The chocolate fell from Margaret's fingers, landed on the white sheet. She stared at it, this thing that was supposed to be a gift, a celebration. But all she could see was fire. All she could think was that Dr. Hayes had saved her hand and maybe killed her mother. Both things could be true. Both things were true. She started to cry. Not the desperate sobs of surgery or the relief tears of survival. These were different, slower, heavier. The tears of someone who'd just realized the world was more complicated than any propaganda had prepared her for. Thomas wheeled his chair closer. Didn't say anything. Just sat there while she cried. The chocolate melted into the sheet. Outside, Americans celebrated victory. Inside, Margaret mourned everything that victory meant. The days blurred together after that. Dr. Hayes visited every morning and evening to check her hand. The infection receded. The swelling diminished. Pink, healthy tissue appeared at the edges of the surgical sites. On day 5, he removed some of the bandages. Margaret saw her fingers for the first time since the accident. They looked like fingers. Swollen, yes. Scarred, yes. The ring finger had a thick line of stitches running down its length. The index finger sat at a slightly wrong angle. But they were fingers. All 5 of them. Still hers. Hayes began physical therapy on day 7. Simple exercises. Try to make a fist. Try to spread your fingers. Try to touch your thumb to each fingertip. Margaret could barely move them. The pain was excruciating. But they moved. Just millimeters, but they moved. Good, Hayes said each time. That's good. Keep trying. He never mentioned the bombing. Never brought up Munich or the war or the fact that he'd tried to burn her city while her mother was in it. They existed in a space beyond that surgeon and patient builder and broken thing being rebuilt. But Margaret couldn't forget. Every time he touched her hand, every time he adjusted a splint or demonstrated an exercise, she thought, these hands dropped fire on my home. These hands saved my future, both, simultaneously. True. On day 10, Hayes brought someone new to examine her. An older doctor, a specialist from the base hospital. They spoke in English over her hand, pointing at the x-rays, discussing the bone alignment and tendon repair. The specialist seemed impressed, shook Hayes's hand, said something that made Hayes smile slightly. After he left, Hayes sat in the chair beside Margaret's bed. He looked exhausted still, but less so, like he'd been carrying a weight and someone had lifted part of it. He says the surgery was successful, Hayes told her in his broken German. The bones are healing correctly. The tendons are integrating. You should regain approximately 80% of normal function within 6 months, maybe more with diligent therapy. 80% is enough to work a telegraph key. More than enough. Hayes paused. You're going to be fine, Margaret. You're going to have a future. She looked at him. At this man who'd killed and healed with equal precision. Why did you really do it? Save my hand? Hayes was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bird was singing. Somewhere guards were changing shifts. The normal sounds of the camp continuing around them. You know about Emily, he said finally. What I didn't tell you is that after she died, I volunteered for combat, asked to be assigned to a bomber squadron, wanted to kill something, anything, because I couldn't save her, and the anger had to go somewhere. He met Margaret's eyes. I flew 17 missions over Germany, dropped enough incendiary bombs to burn a dozen cities, told myself I was ending the war, told myself I was saving American lives, but really I was just angry, just destroying things because I couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. Silence. When you came in with that crushed hand when I saw your father's photograph, I recognized something. The same precision, the same care, the same kind of hands Emily should have had. He shook his head. I don't know if I saved your hand for you or for her or for myself. Maybe all three. But I know that building something felt better than burning things, even if the thing I built can't undo any of the things I burned. Margaret felt the tears starting again. My mother might have died in one of your raids. I know. And you still saved me. I know. Hayes stood, adjusted her blanket with automatic medical efficiency. War makes monsters of us all, Margaret. The only question is whether we stay monsters after. I'm trying not to, that's all. Just trying. He left. Margaret lay in the bed and looked at her hand. 5 fingers, saved by the man who might have killed her mother. The world had never been so complicated and simple at the same time. June came. The heat in Texas became oppressive. The POW camp settled into a routine. Work details during the day, food and rest at night. News from Germany was sporadic and terrible. Cities destroyed, millions dead, the country divided by occupying forces. Margaret's hand continued to heal. She could make a fist now, could grip a pencil, could tap her fingers on a table in something approximating Morse code rhythm. Hayes said she was recovering faster than expected, said she had determination most patients lacked. My father taught me, she told him. Precision requires practice, every day. On June 15th, the Red Cross delivered mail to the camp. Letters from Germany filtered through military censors, months delayed. Thomas got a letter from his wife. She'd survived. Their son had survived. Hamburg was ruins, but they were alive. Margaret got a letter from her father. She held it for 10 minutes before opening it. Her hands were shaking. Both of them now not from injury, but from fear. Inside 3 pages, her father's careful script, dated March 1945, before the surrender, before the end. Dearest Greta, it began. He told her about Munich, about the firebombings that had turned the city centre to ash, about the shop destroyed, completely nothing left but rubble and twisted metal, about the neighbours who'd died, about the nights in bomb shelters listening to the world end above them, about her mother. She'd died in the November 1944 raid. The big one, the one that killed 40,000 people in a single night. She'd been in the shelter, but the shelter had taken a direct hit. Her father had survived only because he'd been on fire watch duty on the roof of another building. Margaret read that part 3 times before it became real. Her mother was dead, had been dead for 7 months, had died while Margaret was operating a telegraph in Bavaria, sending coded messages that meant nothing, accomplishing nothing, serving a cause that was already lost. The letter continued. Her father had left Munich, he wrote. Gone to live with his sister in a village that had been spared the worst of the bombing. He was alive. He was safe. He missed her. He prayed she was safe too. I think often of your hands. The letter ended. I hope you still have them. I hope the war hasn't taken that from you. Whatever happens, know that I love you. Know that your mother loved you. Know that you carry us with you always. Margaret folded the letter carefully, put it back in its envelope, set it on the table beside her bed. Then she stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over the camp. Her mother had been dead for 7 months, which meant she'd been dead when Margaret was captured, dead when Margaret ate bacon and felt guilty, dead when Margaret ate chocolate and thought about her mother starving. The guilt had been for a ghost. The shame had been for someone who was already beyond hunger. It should have made it better. It didn't. Somehow it made it worse. Because Margaret had suffered that guilt for nothing, had carried that weight while her mother was already gone, already beyond caring whether her daughter ate or starved. Dr. Hayes found her there an hour later. He didn't ask what happened, just stood beside her looking out the same window at the same Texas landscape that looked nothing like Munich. My mother is dead, Margaret said. November 1944. Firebombing. Hayes closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Were you there November 1944? No. My last mission was October. but I knew men who flew November raids. So you didn't kill her, but someone like you did? Yes. They stood in silence. Outside, German prisoners were playing soccer, their laughter carrying across the field. American guards watched, smoking cigarettes, occasionally shouting encouragement. The war was over, but the echoes continued rippling outward, touching everyone. "Does it change anything?" Hayes asked quietly. "Knowing she's gone?" Margaret thought about it. No, and yes. The guilt is different now. Not less. Just different. She looked at her hand, at the scars, at the fingers that worked now, that could grip and flex and tap out Morse code. She died so I could live, not literally. But the bombing that killed her is the same war that led to my capture, that led to my hand being crushed, that led to you saving it. It's all connected. And you hate me for it. No. The word surprised her, but it was true. I don't hate you. I don't know what I feel, but it's not hate. Hayes nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For all of it. The bombs, the war, the fact that I can't undo any of it. But you can build something new. That's what you said. I'm trying. Margaret held up her right hand, flexed the fingers, 5 of them, all working. You already did. The repatriation order came in late June. German POWs with medical clearance would be sent back to Europe in waves. Non-essential personnel first, women before men. Margaret qualified on both counts. Dr. Hayes did her final examination on June 28th. He checked each finger's range of motion, tested grip strength, made her demonstrate typing motions on an imaginary telegraph key. Finally, he nodded. You're cleared for travel. Full recovery is still months away, but the hand is stable. The infection is gone. You can go home. Home. Munich in ruins. Her mother dead. Her father living with relatives in a village whose names she could barely remember. Home was a word that didn't mean what it used to. Hayes prepared her discharge papers. Medical records to take with her, instructions for continued therapy, a letter for whatever doctor she'd see in Germany explaining the surgery, the recovery timeline, the exercises she needed to continue. He handed her the packet, then reached into his desk and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. One more thing. Margaret unwrapped it. Inside was her mother's wedding ring, the silver band they'd cut off before surgery. Hayes had had it cleaned, polished. It gleamed like new. Thought you'd want it back, he said. She slipped it onto her ring finger. It fit perfectly over the scar. Thank you. And this. He handed her an envelope. Don't open it until you're home, until you've found your father, until you're ready. She took it, felt something inside. Paper. Something else. What is it? A letter and some money. Not much, but enough to help you start over. Margaret looked at him. At this man who'd killed and healed, who'd destroyed and built, who'd given her back her future without being able to undo her past. I don't know how to thank you. Then don't. Just... Hayes paused, searching for words. Just live. Use those hands I spent 4 hours saving. Build something good. That's thanks enough. The transport left the next morning. Margaret stood in line with 40 other German prisoners' women, mostly all of them thin and haunted, and carrying nothing but the clothes they'd been issued and whatever letters or photographs they'd managed to keep. Dr. Hayes came to see them off. He walked down the line, shaking hands with the ones he'd treated. When he reached Margaret, he stopped. Before she could speak, he reached into his coat one more time, pulled out the brass telegraph key from the hospital room, the one Margaret had practiced finger exercises on during recovery, tapping out phantom messages while her tendons learned to work again. Take this, he said, pressing it into her left hand. Her right hand still couldn't grip properly. You'll need it. For practice. For remembering. She cradled the key against her chest. The brass was warm from his pocket, worn smooth in the places where countless fingers had tapped out messages over the years. I'll use it every day, she said. Hayes nodded. I know you will. Then she switched to English, the words carefully practiced. I never forget you. You give me future. Hayes smiled. Tired, but genuine. You gave me something too, Margaret. You reminded me why I became a doctor. They shook hands, her right hand in his. The grip was firm despite the scars, despite everything. Then she climbed onto the truck and it drove away, and Dr. Hayes became a figure in the distance, getting smaller until he disappeared entirely. The journey back to Europe took 3 weeks, shipped to France, train to the American occupation zone in Germany, processing center where they checked papers and assigned destinations, then finally a local train to the village where her father was living. She found him in a small house at the edge of town. He was thinner than she remembered, greyer, older, but his hands were the same, steady, precise, still the hands of a clockmaker, even without clocks to make. When he saw her, he wept. When he saw her right hand, he wept harder. You kept it, he said, holding her hand in both of his. Du hast es behalten. You kept it. An American surgeon saved it. 4 hours of surgery. He rebuilt it piece by piece. Her father examined each finger, the scars, the slight crookedness of the index finger, the thickness where the ring finger had been stitched. Remarkable. Whoever did this had real skill, real precision. He learned from his father, a watchmaker, like you. They sat together in the small house. Margaret told him everything. The accident, the capture, the journey to Texas, the bacon that tasted like guilt, the chocolate that tasted like defeat, the surgery that lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes, Dr. Hayes and his dead daughter and his bombing missions and his attempts to build instead of destroy. Her father listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Open the letter, he said finally. The one the surgeon gave you. Margaret had almost forgotten. She pulled the envelope from her bag. Inside was a photograph. A young girl at a piano, dark hair, bright eyes, hands poised over keys they could no longer play. Emily Hayes, age 9. Below the photograph, a note in Dr. Hayes's handwriting. This is what I was fighting to save in you. A future, a life, a daughter someone loves. Thank you for letting me save one more. R.H. And beneath that folded bills, American dollars, 50 of them. A fortune. Margaret's father looked at the photograph for a long time. He lost his daughter but saved mine. That's not balance. That's not justice. But maybe it's something. What do I do with this? Margaret held up the money. How do I accept this? By living, by using those hands, by becoming what he hoped you'd become. Her father touched her scarred fingers gently, by building something that matters. Margaret did live. She got a job with the Deutsche Bundespost in 1946 as soon as the postal service was reorganized. Telegraph operator. Her fingers were slower than before, her grip not quite as strong, but she could still tap out 40 words per minute. Still read signals others missed. She worked there for 52 years, never married, never had children. Poured everything into her work, into precision, into the daily practice of gratitude that was every keystroke of every message. People asked sometimes about her scars. She told them the truth. American surgeon, Texas, 1945. Most people nodded and changed the subject. The war had given everyone scars. Hers just showed. She wrote to Dr. Hayes once in 1960, 15 years after the surgery, told him she was well, that her hand worked, that she was using it every day, that she thought of him sometimes and wondered if he knew what his 4 hours had meant. The letter came back marked, "Return to sender, addressee deceased." She learned later he'd died in 1956. Heart attack, age 52, too young. But then the war had aged everyone who'd lived through it. She kept his photograph of Emily, kept his letter, kept the telegraph key he'd given her that last morning in Texas. Used it for practice at home, the brass worn even smoother by her fingers over decades. In 1975, someone from the National World War II Museum contacted her. They were doing an exhibition on medical innovations during the war. Someone had found Dr. Hayes's surgical notes from her operation. Would she be willing to share her story? She said yes. Donated the photograph, the letter, the telegraph key, her own medical records. X-rays from 1945 showing the shattered bones and from 1975 showing them perfectly healed. The exhibit opened in 1976. The Hand That Remembers Enemies' Healers and the Cost of Survival. Margaret attended the opening, stood in front of the display case containing her life. Beside her, a young woman asked her companion, "Do you think she was grateful to the surgeon who saved her?" Margaret almost answered, almost said grateful doesn't cover it. Grateful is too small a word for what it means to have someone spend 4 hours rebuilding your future when they could have taken 4 minutes to end it. Grateful doesn't include the guilt. Doesn't include the knowledge that the hands that saved you also burned your city. Doesn't include the weight of surviving when your mother didn't. But she said nothing, just stood there looking at the display, at the evidence of her salvation and her shame. She died in 1998. Heart failure. Alone in her apartment in Munich. She was 76 years old. Her niece found her diary when cleaning out the apartment. The final entry written the week before she died. I have lived 53 years since Dr. Hayes saved my hand. 53 years of tapping out messages on a telegraph key. 53 years of using these fingers he spent 4 hours rebuilding. I never married. Never had children. Never let anyone get close enough to ask why I sometimes woke crying from dreams of bacon and fire. Mutti died while I was operating a telegraph in Bavaria. Died while I was serving a cause that was already lost. Dr. Hayes might have been the one who dropped the bombs that killed her. I will never know. I don't want to know. He gave me a future. She gave me life. I spent 53 years trying to honor both debts, and I don't know if I succeeded. I worked hard. I was precise. I remembered what Papa taught me about craftsmanship and what Dr. Hayes showed me about mercy. But I was also alone. I held people at a distance because getting close meant explaining these scars, and explaining the scars meant reliving the guilt. The bacon guilt, the chocolate guilt, the survivor guilt of being saved when millions weren't. Dr. Hayes died in 1956. He never knew if I survived the return to Germany. Never knew if his 4 hours meant anything. I wish I'd told him. I wish I'd found the words before it was too late. These hands he saved have sent 1,000,000 messages. Precise, quick, useful. But I never sent the one message that mattered. Thank you for giving me 53 years I shouldn't have had. I'm sorry I didn't use them better. I'm sorry I let the guilt win more than the gratitude. Tomorrow I'll go to work. I'll tap out messages with these scarred fingers. I'll remember Papa and Mutti and Emily Hayes and the surgeon who saved me, and I'll try once more to deserve the gift. She didn't go to work the next day. Her heart stopped during the night. Quiet, peaceful, alone. The museum added her diary to the exhibit, updated the display with her death date, added a final placard. Margaret Schneider worked as a telegraph operator for 52 years after the war. She never married, had no children, and rarely spoke of her time as a POW. Dr. Robert Hayes died in 1956, 11 years after saving Margaret's hand. He never knew if she survived the return to Germany. In her diary's final entry she wrote, "He saved my hand so I could work. My mother died so I could survive. I spent my life paying both debts, and I'm not sure either one is ever paid." The telegraph key she used for 52 years is displayed here. Both surgeon and patient are buried on different continents, but this small brass instrument remains a monument to precision survival and the complicated weight of mercy in wartime. Visitors to the museum pause at the exhibit, read the placards, look at the X-rays showing bones shattered and bones healed. Look at the photograph of a young German woman with scared eyes and a bandaged hand. Look at the photograph of an American surgeon with tired eyes and steady hands. Most visitors move on after a few minutes, but some stay longer. Stand in front of the telegraph key and think about hands, about what it means to destroy and build, about guilt and gratitude, about the debts we carry and the gifts we're given and the complicated weight of surviving when others don't. The key sits silent now. No fingers tap its brass contacts, no messages flow through its circuits, but it remembers. The way metal remembers pressure, the way scars remember wounds, the way history remembers both the burning and the building, both the bombs and the surgery, both the deaths and the impossible, complicated, insufficient but real mercy of 4 hours spent saving 5 fingers that should have been sawed off and thrown away. In the quiet of the museum, the key waits, a small brass monument to precision, to survival, to the hand that remembers everything it cost to remain whole.